Welcome to all, to many who are returning, some after 50 years when you graduated down the hill, some after last year who are here in this row. But to each of you, a very special welcome to the annual Pitt Lectureship of Berkeley Divinity School at Yale. My name is Greg Sterling. I'm the Dean of Yale Divinity School, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you. This lectureship was established by the family of Louis Weatherby Pitt, who lived from 1893 to 1959. He was a distinguished alum and a trustee of Berkeley Divinity School. The lectureship was given to honor his passion for preaching and promotion of a worldwide vision of Christianity. The fund was augmented in 1989 as a memorial to Blanche Parmalee Pitt, his beloved wife. And it is a real pleasure to be able to recognize, as members of our audience today, Louis Pitt, their son, and his niece, Polly Pitt Whiteside, who are with us and who I think make it an annual practice to attend this lectureship. So we're very grateful to you, to your family, for the benefaction and the privilege that we all have to enjoy a lecture along the lines that honor your father. Previous speakers in this series form a roster of significant luminaries, including Theodore Parker Ferris, Rowan Williams, our own Catherine Tanner, Robin Eames, and Trevor Mwamba, a bishop from Africa, to mention only a few. This year's speaker will add to the luster of the list. Joseph Britton is a president and dean of Berkeley Divinity School at Yale and an associate dean and holder of the McFadden Chair in Pastoral Theology at Yale Divinity School. He was educated at Harvard and then at the General Theological Seminary and finally at the Institut Catholique de Paris, where he was the Episcopal Church Foundation Fellow and also the Skyfe Anderson Fellow at the Institut Orthodoxe Saint-Serge in Paris. During the 11 years of his presidency and his deanship, Joe has introduced a number of major initiatives at Berkeley Divinity School, including, among others, the Wesley Royce Leadership Colloquium, the ELM program. Some of the key people in each of these are also in our audience today. The adoption of the rule of life and new urban ministry internships. He has faithfully served as one of the three key faculty offering the core course in Anglican studies. And while doing all of that, he has managed to find time to write a major monograph that was just released by T&T Clark called Abraham Heschel and the Phenomenon of Piety, which is also the subject of his talk this afternoon. Following his talk, I will introduce the respondent, and following the respondent, we will hopefully have time for a few questions and answers. But will you please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Dean Joe Britton.
I have to say that listening to that list of previous Pitt lectures makes me feel a bit like a donkey running in the Kentucky Derby, but be that as it may, here we are. Before we begin the lecture, I'd like to dedicate it to the memory of Dean Michael Allen. He was the dean who was charged by the trustees to close the school and instead brought it to Yale. And in many ways, I think it can be said that the school owes its very life to his vision and leadership. And as you may know, he died recently in St. Louis, Missouri, where he had served as the cathedral dean and then retired. So it is in his memory and to the celebration of his ministry that this talk is dedicated. So piety. Piety is not a word that we use much these days. When was the last time you thought to call someone pious? Historically, however, piety has had a very rich cultural and religious meaning. It was once part of the common parlance of both civic and religious identity. In the ancient world, for example, pietas, the Latin version of the word, referred to that sense of filial obligation that one had to parents, to country, and even to God. Cicero described piety as the justice we owe towards the gods. In the Bible, piety is the fear of God, which is the beginning of wisdom. In the early church, piety was thought of as the true worship of the true God, to quote Augustine's Enchiridion. Or in the Franciscan tradition, Duns Scotus emphasized theology as a practical rather than a theoretical science, and asked the essential question of piety, which is, how do we love God rightly? Fast forwarding ahead to the Reformation, we see in the Reformed tradition a strong emphasis on the importance of individual piety. Calvin, for example, described his Institutes of the Christian Religion as a summary of the whole of piety. And he defined piety as that reverence joined with the love of God, which the knowledge of his benefits induces. Indeed, in the Calvinist tradition, some of the most popular and common books of the early modern world were books on piety. One might think of Lewis Bailey's The Practice of Piety from 1611, which went through multiple editions, not only in England, but here in the American colonies. And I suppose one could even argue that the Anglican emphasis upon the pursuit of holiness is in effect about the cultivation of piety. Think of such works as Jeremy Taylor's Holy Living and Holy Dying, or of William Law's A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. Yet despite this very long and rich history, piety has largely dropped out of our modern religious lexicon. Now, when we do use the word, we tend to think of it in a rather pejorative sense. To us, a pious person who is someone who is a bit too religious, supercilious even, hypocritical. Yet, if we go back to the way that piety was understood in the classical manner, that is, as a life lived with a great and deep reverence for God, it has the potential to reassert itself in our own day as an important topic for reflection. We are, of course, all familiar with the language of spirituality that is so common these days, but to the extent that our contemporary notions of spirituality tend to refer only to a sense of personal inwardness and well-being, spirituality is in many ways fundamentally secular in nature and essentially amoral in character. Piety, on the other hand, directs us outward, away from ourselves, towards God, to a sense of obligation and responsibility, to an attitude of reverence for one another and reverence for God's own image as we see it in one another, and a reverence for God's creation. Piety, in other words, is a theocentric life, a life that is centered on God and not just a spiritual one. And the consequence of such a life, a pious life, is that we find ourselves to be motivated by such a sense of awe and wonder, dependence, gratitude, and obligation, that piety becomes what the ethicist James Gustafson called the hinge which joins the frame of the moral and natural ordering of life to the door of human duties. For a pious person, in other words, morality and religion are inextricably intertwined. Both are evoked by God, our sense of religion and our sense of morality, and both are directed back towards God. Now, that's a pretty robust description of what piety is. And if you were to hold that idea of Christian life up against the current state of many of the weakened mainline churches, you might find yourself thinking that what we face in these churches could be described as nothing less than a crisis of piety, a crisis of real substance. The thin soup we have too often served to our congregations that is made up in equal measures of a doctrinally weak theology, an anodyne idea of spiritual growth, and a vague aura of social respectability, has simply turned out to be insufficient for supporting anything like a full-bodied ecclesial life that is imagined by such an idea as a God-centered piety. So you might ask, what does piety look like? What are we talking about anyway? Well, on your way here to Marquand Chapel, you may have passed by the icons of the civil rights movement that are on display in the Divinity School's entry hall. And if you didn't, I would encourage you to pass by those at some point today while you're here. If you have seen them, you perhaps notice there a very striking portrait of what an authentic Christian piety can look like. There are the great heroes of Christian social witness, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Jonathan Daniels, and many, many more. And they were able to confront the great evils of racial segregation in our country precisely because they knew how to connect their struggle for justice on the one hand with the great truths of God's judgment and restoration and promises of mercy on the other. Their piety, in other words, was forged on the hard anvil of having to trust in God when there seemed no reason to do so. They had to make the story of Israel's bondage in Egypt their own story, and then to see themselves as having their own place in God's leading of the children of Israel in crossing the Red Sea to freedom. Having centered their moral and religious imagination in God, these leaders of the civil rights movement were able to put their life on line for what their piety had taught them about the nature of God's justice and mercy. So that's one image of piety. But among those icons, there also hangs an image of Abraham Joshua Heschel, an American Jew, an American Jewish theologian, who became famous for walking arm in arm with Martin Luther King during the March on Selma. The text that appears below Heschel's portrait on that icon is telling. He said that during the march, he felt as if my legs were praying. As a theologian, Heschel was himself very concerned about this issue of the decline of piety, which for him, of course, meant especially the decline in Jewish observance in the American context due to the twin forces of assimilation and secularism. But his concern for piety was about more than that. It wasn't just about the Jewish community and its own decline of religious observance. He worried that our very ability as human beings to experience awe and wonder at the mystery of creation is gradually being smothered by the overwhelming forces of technical civilization in modern life. Heschel once defined piety as a life compatible with God's presence. But his most urgent concern was that such a life becomes increasingly difficult to find or even to imagine in our churches and synagogues because our senses as human beings have been so dulled to the underlying mystery of life. The problem today, Heschel once said, is not a lack of sensitivity to God. We are not even sensitive to God's creation. Unless we know how to be sensitive to God's glory and know something of his presence in the world, we will never know anything of his essence. So Heschel made a pretty overt point of a self-proclaimed mission in life, which was to rekindle the possibility for authentic piety. And it is that intention that makes him worth our consideration here this afternoon. So let me tell you a little bit about Heschel and who he was, in case you don't know much about him as a person. Heschel was born into a prominent Hasidic family in 1907 in Poland, and he died a professor of Jewish ethics and mysticism at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York in 1972. He grew up in a devoutly observant community, which in many ways became the source for much of his own insight into the meaning of what faith and piety look like. In a little book that he wrote called The Earth is the Lord's, after the Second World War, when he realized that much of the world he had grown up with no longer existed, he attempted to paint a portrait of what he remembered of the intense piety that he had encountered in the world in which he grew up. Here's what he said. He said, "The people there were taught to care for the most distant, even in the most immediate, knowing that the passing is a reflection of the lasting, that the tables in their humble homes could become consecrated altars. Characteristic of their piety was unheroic sacrifice, unassuming, inconspicuous devotion, rather than extravagance or mortification or asceticism. Their purpose was to ennoble the common, to endow worldly things with hieratic beauty." Now, notice that for Heschel, piety is not a rare and unusual quality that's found only in great spiritual leaders, the kind that we might read about in the newspaper or hear about on the radio. No, for him, piety was characteristic of an entire community and observable in the most ordinary habits of the believing men and women whose lives were lived with a constant awareness of the presence of God. But Heschel chose to leave this tight-knit world of his Hasidic youth to study philosophy and theology at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where he ended up being the last Jew to finish a doctoral dissertation before the Nazis saw to it that that was no longer possible. Indeed, he had to publish his dissertation in Poland because the publication of Jewish dissertations in Germany had already been made illegal. So, seeing the writing on the wall, he escaped from his native Poland, first to London and then to the United States, where he eventually settled in New York at the Jewish Theological Seminary. As you can tell from his inclusion in those icons that are down the hall, he's perhaps best known to an American audience as an active participant in the civil rights movements and also the anti-war movement of the 1960s and 70s. But he was also influential in the evolution of Jewish-Christian dialogue. He was, for example, an invited participant at the Second Vatican Council and had a large hand in the crafting of the document Nostra Aetate, which was the first time the Catholic Church forswore mission to the Jews as a part of its mission. And he established himself as one of the first to recognize the commonality between Christians and Jews, and was one of the first to say that Christians are fundamentally Jewish at heart. He's perhaps best known for some of his more popular books, theologically speaking, such as his meditation on the Sabbath or his study of the prophets, which still shows up on many seminary reading lists. The idea that shows up most often in regards to Heschel as a theologian is perhaps his insight into what he called God's pathos, God's feeling, God's transitive concern for us as human beings. Heschel read the scriptures of the Hebrew Bible and simply couldn't find there any support for the impassible God of much of Western theology, that is, a God who is remote and unattached and uninvolved in human affairs. No, Heschel said, the God of Hebrew Scriptures is deeply moved by what happens in human history. God reacts with anger, with joy, with longing, with concern, with regret, with with any range of human emotion. And so Heschel talked about God's pathos as including a call to human beings to enter into God's own creative act as a partnership with God in realizing the vision that God had for us in creating us in God's image and likeness in the first place. And hence the title of two of Heschel's most overtly theological works, Man is Not Alone, and God in Search of Man. But aside from all these things for which Heschel is perhaps better known, what is less known is his lifelong commitment to studying, rekindling, and strengthening the life of piety. In a sense, one might even say that piety was his subject. At least that's the argument that I make in the book that Dean Sterling mentioned a few moments ago on Heschel, in which I argue that piety was in effect his starting point for theology. Because even before we get in our thinking to the point of asking the question of whether God exists, Heschel wanted to point around us and say, well, look, there are examples of pious men and women in every age and in every culture. And what would give rise to a life that is lived in such a way? What is the reality that is lying behind that would cause someone to live the life of piety? Piety, in other words, became a kind of back door for Heschel into the question of God, where one encounters the effects of God's engagement with humanity even before one has a very certain idea of the nature of who that God is. No wonder then that an authentic piety of faithfulness to God was so important to him. The pious life is a meeting point where we both verify God's concern for humanity and learn to understand what our response to it can and should be. Now, when Heschel left his native Poland to study German philosophy and theology in Berlin, he was at first rather taken aback by what he found to be the sterility of the kinds of questions that were being asked in the academy. The sense of wonder and awe and mystery with which he had grown up simply seemed to have no place in the largely rational Kantian environment of the German university. What Heschel gradually discovered, however, was an antidote to this sterility in an alternative approach to thinking about the questions of human being. Namely, he discovered the phenomenological method as espoused by such philosophers as Wilhelm Dilthey and Edmund Husserl. In these thinkers, he found a method of studying human being that tries to take life as it is found, as a phenomenon that we simply see existing around us. And rather than posing hypothetical or rarefied questions like philosophy often does, phenomenology wants to ask questions like, what is the structure of human life? How do people go about organizing their thinking and their patterns of living in such a way that give meaning and purpose to them? So, for Heschel, piety became the obvious subject for such a study. Heschel's phenomenological method was first made evident in the doctoral study that he completed in Berlin, which was a study of the consciousness of the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. Then, following its completion in 1937, he turned his attention to the phenomenon of piety itself in an essay that he published soon after he arrived in America in 1942. The essay was entitled simply, An Analysis of Piety. And in this little essay, one can see clearly Heschel's essential methodology at work, which he succinctly summarized in these words. He said, in penetrating the consciousness of the pious person, we may perceive the reality behind it. In other words, looking at the example of piety, we can see something of God. Heschel proposes to discern God by studying the response that an awareness of God evokes in human life. And in the essay, Heschel turns his attention in a more formal, analytical way to the pious men and women with whom he had grown up, examining the pattern and structure of their own lives. He observes, for example, that for them, piety was a way of living which responds to transcendence, a means of concrete response to the other. Such piety, Heschel says, points to something beyond itself. It is the orientation of human inwardness towards the holy. It is faith translated into life, spirit embodied in personality. We all know such people, don't we? If you think about it. There are, of course, those prominent holy women and holy men whose names we easily recognize, perhaps a Dorothy Day, or a Mother Teresa, or maybe Oscar Romero. But Heschel wants us to understand that piety is also something that we can observe close at hand, in our very midst. In every parish, for example, there are certain people whose piety, whose sanctity is quietly lived, and which any parish priest knows is the heartbeat, the blood that gives life to the parish, and yet often goes unrecognized. You know where you find them. They're the holy women who turn up daily at morning prayer, or they're the holy men who show up at the soup kitchen on Christmas Day to feed the hungry, or they're the ones who volunteer to take the sacrament on a Sunday afternoon to those who are shut in at home. Piety can be as ordinary and as humble as it can be heroic and prominent. So at this point, we might step back and try to take a larger view of this subject of piety and see if what I've been saying about Heschel's take on piety has any importance in the larger context of modern theology. In a sense, we're coming to the so what question. And in fact, what I want to argue in the rest of the lecture is that Heschel's methodological turn towards piety as a theological subject is strategically much more important than might at first meet the eye. And if we are going to understand fully the significance of what he's up to, we're going to have to understand something of the consequences of what his strategy are. So to do so, we're going to have to turn our attention to two towering figures of 19th and 20th century theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher and Karl Barth. This is the moment you have been waiting for. Now, these two thinkers, many of you know, represent opposite poles of one of the classic theological debates in Christian theology. And to put it much too simply, the debate is essentially this: whether we can know God through our own direct apprehension, that's the Schleiermacher, or only through God's self-revelation, that's the Barth. Heschel, I want to argue, ultimately represents a third way, which wants to draw together both options. And that seems to me to be what's most significant about what he's up to. So let's see if we can figure out how he does that. Schleiermacher, of course, was an early 19th century German philosopher and theologian in the Reformed tradition who is often thought of as the father of modern liberal theology. That is, a theology that tries to take into account the Enlightenment critiques of faith by offering a rational foundation for religious belief. Like Calvin before him, Schleiermacher understood human beings to have the seeds of piety sown within their consciousness by the Creator. It's a part of the very fabric of who we are. Piety, he argued, is the innate sense of the consciousness of absolute dependence, or which is the same thing of being in relation to God. That is, when we try to give an account of where we came from, or of who we are, we realize that we really can't do it. The only way we can account for ourselves is to posit the idea of God, the one upon whom our creation, our very being, is absolutely dependent. Piety, then, this sense of absolute dependence, is our realization that our existence is absolutely dependent on the creative act of God. Now, the essential point to be taken here is the emphasis that Schleiermacher places on the subjective experience of the pious individual. It's we as individual people who have this sense of absolute dependence. It's not something we come to as an ecclesial body, but through our own self-reflection. Now, that priority that he puts on the individual's feeling of absolute dependence is the very thing that comes under attack in Karl Barth's subsequent 20th century critique. Barth argued that Schleiermacher was simply too confined in what he called the anthropological horizon, that is, paying attention to the way we as human beings think about God. As Barth put it in his 1956 lecture, The Humanity of God, theology under Schleiermacher, quote, had become religionistic, anthropocentric, and in this sense, humanistic. That is, religion was more about us than about God. It had lost sight of the deity of God, the absolute otherness of God, the uniqueness of God as the one who is wholly other, beyond our knowing, who comes to us and who is known to us only as God chooses to disclose God's self to us. Barth maintained that in order to protect the indispensable otherness of God's utterly superior divine being, God has to be made the sole and unique agent in the act of revelation. We know about God only what God chooses to reveal. So given the unreliability of the religious experience of the individual, Barth maintained, the empirical descriptive method of Schleiermacher's concept of piety simply could not be trusted to yield authoritative concepts and doctrines. That work can only be done by a method of knowing in which God discloses the nature of God's own self to us. So, do you see what happens to piety in this critique of the individual feeling of dependence? Because of the assumed antithesis between Schleiermacher's emphasis on personal religion on the one hand and Barth's emphasis on divine revelation on the other, the role of piety as a primary datum for theological reflection effectively drops out of the theological equation altogether. There's just no room for it if we are influenced by Barth's perception that it's only God's revelation and God's initiative to make God's self known to us. Now, this is where it seems to me that Heschel enters the scene. Namely, in resistance to the exclusively theocentric emphasis of a Barthian theology of revelation, Heschel reasserts the theological relevance of how the content of revelation is received and enacted in the lives of pious individuals. We become a kind of sounding board for God's revelation, and we are the place where that is authenticated and verified. And then on the other hand, in resistance to the more anthropocentric emphasis of Schleiermacher's concept of absolute dependence, Heschel insists on the priority of the divine initiative, which evokes in the pious individual an objective sense of reverence and requiredness. We don't discover piety by ourselves, in other words. It's only because we sense God's revelation to us that we respond with piety. But it's only because we respond with piety that we become aware of the content and meaning and influence of God's revelation upon human life. So one might say that working from his distinctly Jewish perspective, Heschel does not so much insert piety into the theological discussion from the outside as that he reclaims it from within the tradition itself, following its systematic eclipse in the wake of Barth. Now, I know that I may have lost some of you a bit with all this German theology, and if that's true, you wouldn't be the first, so don't worry. But I'm going to tell you what the essential point is. It's this. Heschel is an instance of a theologian who takes very seriously what we can learn about God by paying close attention to the example of pious individuals around us who try to live a life that is compatible with the revelation that God gives us. And the consequence, I think, is that Heschel helps us to chart a way for theology to recover a stronger concern for the question, how do we love God rightly, as a balance to the corresponding question that has tended to preoccupy modern theology, which is, how do we know God truly? How do we love God rightly, as opposed to how do we know God truly? Heschel wants us to ask both of those questions. And the pattern by which faithful men and women live their lives in response to God's initiative has as much to say to us about God as does our rational reflection upon the content of that revelation. As Heschel himself put it, drawing these two trajectories together, piety is the realization and verification of the transcendent in human life. Now, perhaps all this would become a little bit clearer if I gave you another example of a theologian who has deployed piety as an important subject for theological reflection. And my example is going to be someone who may be a bit more familiar to many of you, that is Rowan Williams. In his book, Tokens of Trust, which is a collection of talks that Williams originally delivered during Holy Week in Canterbury Cathedral, he makes use of the example of pious men and women in a manner that I think is actually quite close to that of Heschel. These essays are written in a very pastoral tone. He's trying to make the Christian faith accessible to people who have come to the cathedral seeking the experience of Christian faith. And they try to lay out a case for belief that will make sense to ordinary people in our current age. But Williams himself acknowledges that at some point, trying to argue people into an experience of God doesn't really work very well, because one can't either prove the existence or the trustworthiness of God. One can only point to the example of certain people who live in a manner that, as Williams puts it, makes God credible. So, retreating from the attempt to offer rational arguments about God, Williams falls back instead upon individuals whose life of faith is one that we find that we can trust or believe in, as he says. Even the Bible itself, Williams notes, has no real arguments for the existence of God. The Bible only has figures like Abraham or Moses or Mary or Paul, who are already caught up in something, the imperative reality of which they can't deny or ignore. That's a great Williams phrase, isn't it? They are caught up in something, the imperative reality of which they can't deny or ignore. And similarly, in our own midst, there are individuals who, he says, take responsibility for making God credible in the world. That's a phrase that Williams takes from Etty Hillesum, who was herself a Jewish victim of the Holocaust. Although Williams doesn't explicitly use the term piety, it is clear to me that the pious individual is the one whom he has in mind. Ultimately, Williams suggests, the encounter with spiritual natives, that is, these people whom we see inhabiting a world that we say to ourselves, that's the world in which I would like to live. That's the world in which I want to belong. That is where I would find myself at home. These spiritual natives may be the most likely moment for us to be able to say to ourselves when we encounter them, I take refuge, I believe, I have confidence, I have come home. So perhaps you see the connection here between Williams and Heschel. They each have a strong conviction that when the words and methods of rational discourse fail us in trying to articulate the reality of God, the example offered by pious men and women provides us with a living embodiment of what we try to put into words but fail to do adequately. Piety makes God credible by showing us what a life motivated by God looks like. And this observation returns us to our point of departure, where I suggested that what we may be in the midst of as American Christians is nothing less than a crisis of piety. I'm put in mind here of Pope Francis's recently published interview in which he reflected on the current state of the Roman Catholic Church. If a besetting problem for us as members of mainline Protestantism in recent decades has been a weakened conviction about the great truths of Christianity, then Pope Francis suggested that the corresponding weakness in the Roman Church has been an overly heavy moralism that has obscured the gospel message of salvation in Jesus Christ. The Church's preaching, he says, has stressed too insistently its moral teachings at the expense of the missionary imperative of healing the world's wounds. And the Pope challenged the institutional church to be more ready to connect with what he called the sanctity, dare we say piety, of the holy middle class of faith. Indeed, among the Pope's messages to the church was a call for its hierarchy to be more mindful of thinking with the church, of paying attention to the patient sanctity of the holy common people of God. This is how it is with Mary, the Pope said. If you want to know who she is, ask the theologians. If you want to know how to love her, ask the people. So if, as Pope Francis observes, it is true that the Church's spiritual and theological health is deeply tied up with the imperative and an attentiveness to the common sanctity of its people, and here's the takeaway from today's lecture, so I'm flagging it for you, then it suggests to me that the most urgent task before us as religious leaders is the cultivation of a deep piety worthy of partnership with God. The most urgent task before us as religious leaders is the cultivation of a deep piety that is worthy of a partnership with God. We must nourish and reclaim our common intuitions of meaning and awe. We must cultivate an attachment to the holy that has a profound sense of wonder, amazement, obligation, requiredness. For the God who is in search of us is the same God who desires for us to rejoice in the life of piety, that reverence joined with love of God, which the knowledge of his benefits induces. I thank you for your attention.
I think my statement that the roster was only glistens a little more brightly by the speaker was a point that we can all say became a reality. We thank you very much, Joe, for your very fine lecture. I think every faculty member dreams of having a word on a dean. And so today, we are privileged to have one of our extraordinary faculty members, faculty emeritus, to offer a word of response to Joe's presentation. David Kelsey, the Luther A. Weigel Professor of Theology Emeritus here at Yale Divinity School, will offer a brief response. David came to Yale as a graduate student, and we never let him leave. He served on the faculty at the Divinity School from 1965, so just a couple of years after the 50-year class graduated down the hill from BDS, and served here with great distinction until 2005. He's the author of at least 7 books, including The Uses of Scripture in Recent Theology in 1975, all the way up to Eccentric Existence of Theological Anthropology in 2009. Please join me in welcoming Professor David Kelsey.
I'll refer to him as Joe rather than Dean. First thing I want to do is congratulate you, Joe, on the publication of this really wonderful book. I'm very enthusiastic about it. His revival of Abraham Heschel as a fruitful theological conversation partner for Christian thinkers is an enormously important contribution. And it's an excellent book, and praise be to God, it's readable. And I recommend that you read it. Heschel is a treasure. My own first encounter with Heschel actually was between graduate school and Yale, when I was teaching some undergraduates, and the course I partly inherited for freshmen. We were on the quarter system, covered something called the Judeo-Christian tradition in 10 weeks, beginning with Abraham and ending with Paul Tillich. And toward the end was Abraham Heschel. It was my first encounter with Heschel's writings, and I was absolutely blown away. The book we used was God in Search of Man, which is just an amazing piece of theology. I have two kind of questions to Joe and one just comment on his thesis. I could also discuss with Joe his interpretations of Schleiermacher and Barth. This would consume the rest of the afternoon in a kind of seminar, which I can imagine on a musical analogy. Somebody explained to me a long time ago what a fugue is. He said, well, it's a musical composition in which each of the musical voices enters one by one, as the audience leaves one by one. Such would be our seminar, I think. So we'll set that aside. A question about Heschel's and the character of Heschel's, what you call his essential methodology. It's captured in Heschel's own sentence that in penetrating the consciousness of the pious person, we may perceive the reality behind it. And I find myself reacting in a kind of yes and maybe way. Piety's main interest surely is, as Heschel says, is a concern for God's own concern. H. Richard Niebuhr put it much the same way when he defined faith as our loyalty to God's cause. That is the thing that God has as a cause. We are to be loyal to it. And the cause that God is loyal to is the well-being of creatures for Heschel. So that piety would be life that's compatible with God's presence. That seems absolutely right. But the question I have is a question that doesn't come up much in the lecture, and I confess I don't remember it coming up very much in God in Search of Man. And it comes from what people are pleased to call the hermeneutics of suspicion. What is that reality behind piety? God's presence, but is it not also tangled up with an awful lot of self-aggrandizement on the part of the pious? And what gives us any distance or leverage on that? And how do we go about disentangling the two? Which then raises questions about just how much weight we can place on the phenomenon of piety. That's the hermeneutics of suspicion kind of question about it. And I'm open to hearing more about it, but that's what I'd like to hear about. That's the first question. The second is about the theme in Heschel that God turns toward humankind in a way that evokes this religious feeling called piety. Our piety is our sympathetic concurrence with God's will. Again, yes and maybe, and it goes kind of like this. Yes, the wonderful thing about putting piety the way Heschel does is that it insists from the get-go that the ethical is simply fundamental to piety, so that the picture of the relation between piety and morality is not like this, that first piety wells up, and then that gives you the motivation and the dynamics to go out and do the good. It's as though cause and effect, or first step, second step. No, not at all. The orientation toward the moral obligation on the neighbor places on me is part and parcel of the pious feeling. That just seems dead right to me. The ethical is just built into piety from the beginning. What I have my question about here is the way we are to understand this divine presence that evokes piety. And maybe this is a point at which a difference between Christianity and Judaism begins to play a role. I'm not sure about that. But isn't it the case that for Christians, God's turning to humankind, that which evokes piety. For Christians, God's turning to humankind just is the very concrete and particular person, Jesus of Nazareth. And if that's the case, then that makes this kind of difference, that what we have sympathetic concurrence with is to be understood in a Christomorphic way, a way shaped, morphe, by our picture of Christ. And so what we're responding to is not a kind of generic religious presence, not a kind of generic divinity in general, and not a kind of generic ethical obligation either, but something made extraordinarily specific by the incarnation. That makes the relation between piety and faith, to say the least, complicated in a very Christianly special way. The final comment I want to make is on what Joe identified as the takeaway. That in a period as ours is of a crisis in piety, the principal challenge to communities of faith is the cultivation of piety. And the citation from Rowan Williams' Tokens of Trust, that the only really effective apologetics in a religiously skeptical culture is a group of human beings living in a manner that makes God credible. That seems absolutely right to me. My colleague years ago in theology, Hans Frey, was always interested in the apologetic arguments that philosophers of religion developed on behalf of believing in God. Always interested in them with a kind of really curiosity. and always wound up his analysis of these arguments by saying, well, wouldn't persuade me. You know, the only thing that really does persuade people is other people really living the Christian faith. It's the same sentiment, it seems to me. I'm wanting to endorse that wholeheartedly, and do so by happy coincidence in connection with something that's come up in a course I'm currently teaching. Now, this is miles away from the lecture, so bear with me. This is a course on theological themes in Reformed, with a capital R, creeds and confessions, starting with the 1500s and ending in the 20th century. Fascinating bunch of documents. We've come this last time we met to the session on Reformed tradition in the colonies in North America. And in particular, beginning in the 1680s, third generation after the Puritans arrive at Plymouth Colony in 1620. The intense piety of the first generation of colonists has faded in the second and almost completely evaporated in the third generation. And the church leaders, who still are politically enormously powerful, are distraught that people simply aren't going to church. Sound familiar? And the question is, what are we going to do about this? And massive steps were taken, first in Massachusetts colony and then in Connecticut. And they did two things. They decided they needed to have a new statement of faith. And so they adopted almost all of the Westminster Confession of Faith. Now, that's a wonderful theological document from the 1600s. It has as much energy to generate spiritual life as a dead dog, but it's intellectually very stimulating. It's intellectually very stimulating. And the second thing they did was tighten up ecclesiastical discipline. We're going to both make clergy do things right, but also we're going to make parishioners do things right, or they'll be excommunicated. And this happened, as I say, first in Boston, and then in Connecticut. The first time that the Congregational churches actually got themselves organized in either colony in what we now call a denomination. And it's fascinating how different towns in Connecticut reacted to this step. Some thought that the provisions were too lax and refused to sign on. That was Fairfield County. Some thought they were too tight and they proceeded to ignore them, and that was New Haven Colony. But the point is, nothing changed until another generation and a half when the Great Awakening came, which addressed the very thing that these people were trying to correct, but that's what really did it. Nobody has a recipe for how to cook up an awakening, but that's what did it. The revival of piety, history proves, is the thing that's called for. Thank you for a lecture that shows it.
Thank you, David, for the very thoughtful questions and remarks. Joe, would you like to have just a couple of minutes to answer or respond to David's questions? And then I will have you out of here by 1:15. So if you're wondering how long will we go, I promise we will finish by 1:15. But we would like to give Joe a couple of minutes to respond. And then if you've been very patient to sit, you might have a question or two. Joe?
Well, first I'd like to thank you, David, for providing the response today, but something you all may not know is that he also read the book in manuscript form and made several very helpful comments that shaped its eventual outcome, and even has a little blurb of endorsement on the back of it, for which I am particularly honored and gracious. The one copy I have of the book, if you all want to look at it, it's on that stand back there. It's an advanced copy. It comes out in December, but if you're curious what it looks like, it's there. But having expressed my appreciation to David, I do want to make a couple comments in response, because I think he put his finger on a couple of key issues that have always troubled me a bit about Heschel's methodology as well. In essence, I understand your question, David, to be this question of how do you understand the divine presence that lies behind piety? How do you define it or determine what it is or give shape or form to it? Especially when we as Christians would want to understand that as taking the specific form of the face of Jesus Christ, showing to us God's own nature. And I think this is a point at which one clearly sees the difference between Heschel as a Jewish theologian and our own thinking as Christians. Because for Heschel, the thing that evokes piety, the thing to which we respond to, is very explicitly stated as the law, as it is given in the prophets. And for him, what we know of God and respond to is nothing other than the will of God for us expressed in the shape of the law. So we don't know God in the same way, obviously, as we Christians understand ourselves to know God through Jesus Christ. For Heschel, we know God through what God has instructed us is the way of life, which leads us into God's ways and is the life for which we were created. So the divine presence that lies behind piety is essentially defined by Heschel in many ways as exactly that. It's the will of God as disclosed through the law. And so he talks in a more analytical way about how we respond to that will. You used the word sympathy. For Heschel, sympathy becomes a very technical term in that he borrows it from another German theologian and phenomenologist, Max Scheler, who talked about how as when we see a human event that evokes our identification with it, like when we say to someone whose child has died, I feel sympathy for you. In the same way, our response to the encounter with God's law is that we feel sympathy for it. We feel identification with it. It's something in whose place we want to put ourselves. And so for him, the reality we discover is not only law, but that law evokes a sympathetic response, which is then the shape of piety. And then your question about the hermeneutic of suspicion. Yeah, Heschel is hard to pin down ultimately on exactly what this piety is. I offered several definitions, but one irony about him is that he actually has a lot of definitions of what piety is, and you can kind of pick and choose which ones you like the best. And in fact, one of the things that first put me onto this topic of looking at piety in Heschel was just reading his work. I was amazed at how often there is a sentence that begins, the pious man, and then there's some predicate that defines some aspect of piety. The pious man senses the transcendent. The pious man responds to God's will. The pious man is embarrassed by his inadequacy in the face of God. On and on it goes. And so in a sense, here's this thing, piety, that Heschel is trying to look at and analyze and understand. And what he does, more or less, is come at it this way, and then this way, and then this way, and then this way. And I think he himself has a certain hermeneutic of suspicion that it's never something you will pin down absolutely, but that one almost has to have a constant suspicion of any particular example, because it is always only a partial example of what piety finally and ultimately is. So perhaps that's a way of responding to the questions that you have raised in a way that perhaps adds a bit more to the context of Heschel's writing. He was not thought of as a systematic theologian, and if there's going to be any big critique leveled against what I've written in the book, one thing will be that, look, you're trying to make a theologian out of somebody who is basically a spiritual writer who is trying to evoke our experience of piety by writing very poetically. So it can be argue perhaps that the whole project is a bit false. But I guess what I've argued, anticipating that critique, is that underlying that very captivating, almost entrancing prose, poetic prose of Heschel, is in fact some of the very serious methodological strategies that I've tried to describe, and that perhaps it's a bit of his genius to put the two together, and so that he can be very beguiling while he is doing something very sophisticated theologically. So let me pause there because there may be questions.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Would anyone in the audience like to pose a question? We do have a microphone, and we'll bring you the mic. If you'll raise your hand, I'd ask you if you would to identify yourself. We don't have much time, so please make the question to the point, if I may ask you to do so. Paul Colbert over here. And please identify whether this is for Joe or for David or both.
This is for Dean Britton. What you say about Abraham Heschel reminds me a lot of Reinhold Niebuhr, who was dissatisfied with your Barthian and your Schleiermachian options, and who also had some real insecurity about whether or not he was a systematician. But if I'm right, he was a dear friend of Heschel's, and in fact gave the funeral oration at Heschel's funeral. And I wonder if you could say a word about perhaps the most famous 20th century liberal Protestant theologian in relationship to Heschel.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. As you know, the Jewish Theological Seminary is directly across the street from the Union Theological Seminary in New York. And Heschel, as part of his outreach to the Christian community, was appointed as a visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary, the first Jew to be so appointed. And there he formed a very close relationship with Reinhold Niebuhr. And it was said that on a fall afternoon, much like today, you could often see them strolling through Riverside Park with both of their arms sort of flailing up in the air as they talked about various issues of theology. And they actually wrote some about one another's work, so we might have some clue about what the content of those conversations was. Heschel found Niebuhr unnecessarily pessimistic about the possibility of human moral perfection, or at least moral progress. And I think in that you hear some of his Jewishness again, in that for Heschel it was very clear that one can progress in the pious life, the moral life, and participate in that way in God's redemption of the world. Niebuhr's sense that human institutions in life is so inherently flawed was not one that Heschel was fond of, and he wrote about that. But on the other hand, Niebuhr was one of the first Christians to recognize in Heschel a useful conversation partner, and fairly early in their friendship identified Heschel in the press as someone who would emerge as one of the great American theologians. So I appreciate you bringing that up. It was apparently a very rich and fruitful partnership between them.
We can have one last question. Yes, David.
My name is David Wilson. If I've understood what you've said, and I may well not have, Heschel said that the piety of human beings is somehow informed by and reflected by the laws of God. And for Christians, it's reflected by the modeling of Jesus Christ as we understand Jesus Christ. My question is, in the end, is the piety of each the same? Or is it a different kind of piety between that that Heschel was describing and that which you would see by human behavior as modeled by Jesus Christ?
I think Heschel's response would be that the structure of the piety in either tradition is much the same. That is, this orientation towards transcendence and the sense of awe and amazement and all that sort of thing. The content of it, though, I think is obviously quite different in that the way we understand ourselves to understand God is, as I was saying, quite different from the Jewish tradition. So I think that's where the rub would come, is that there are certain characteristics of piety that are shared across cultures, in a sense, and religious traditions, and yet the content which evokes that piety and which gives it specific meaning and specific shape as individuals live it out may be quite specific to a particular tradition. So Heschel was one for wanting to make very broad cross-cultural statements in the context of interreligious dialogue, for example. He wrote an essay called No Man is an Island. And in that, quite shockingly to a lot of his fellow Jews, he said, it is evidently God's will that there should be a variety of religious traditions in which God is disclosed. And that really caught a lot of ears off guard, as it were. And but I think that demonstrates the same sort of point, is that he looks across the traditions and sees a commonality of openness to transcendence or piety, which nevertheless is lived as a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian or a Hindu or whatever it might be.
Well, we have really enjoyed Joe's presentation, David's response, the discussion. I want, before we thank them, and we will in just a minute, I want to remind you that at 3 o'clock, the Graduate Society meets. I believe that the Finance Committee also meets this afternoon, 3:30. And at 5 o'clock, Evensong will take place here. It will be an opportunity to honor some very special people, some who are quite dear to the hearts of all of us here that have associated with this school. So please join us again. But I think at this point we should give a rousing thank you to Joe and to David.